Hello, and welcome back to AP Human Geography. Today, I want to talk about urban hierarchy, urban growth, and urban sprawl, and what all those mean and why they're different. So first, now obviously this only goes up to 1990, but the point is not necessarily to have, current numbers, because we will be talking about those later. The point of this graph is to show you that the population has been changing considerably over the last century from predominantly rural to predominantly urban, and not only that, the population has increased significantly from 1900 to almost 2000, right? Because you add 6 billion people to the planet, ultimately, and most of that growth has really, like all of that growth, has actually occurred in cities. Right? And I think that's a very interesting trend. So when we think about urban settlements, cities typically have three characteristics. That should say a city or cities. Anyway, they're usually large, right? They have small social circles compared to population size. And what I mean by that is that people know relatively few people in terms of the population of the city. If you think about small towns, everybody knows everybody, right? I mean, it's that sort of thing. And that is not true in cities. Most of the interactions that you have with people are going to be related to their specific roles in society. Teachers, doctors, clerks, whatever, So it's going to be this much more business type relationship. So what that means is that social relationships are different than in rural settlements. There's also a high density, which is not true in rural settlements. And so you get a specialization of skills, right? People really focus on one skill set for the most part. Okay, so your electrician is different than your plumber, is different than your carpenter, is different, than whatever, your painters, whatever. Whereas in a rural area, you might have one person who's a handyman, right, or woman, as the case may be. So, interestingly enough, this specialization also encourages competition because you're competing for limited customers. There's limited space for you to live. There's limited space for you to work. And so cities tend to be much, much more competitive than rural areas, right? And then there's a social heterogeneity, and that the idea is that you get lots of different kinds of people living in cities because they're all drawn for the same reasons. And the larger the settlement, the more diverse the population is going to be. And because they're usually very diverse, most of the time they're more accepting of, quote, different behaviors. And that may be different cultures, different religions, different lifestyles, whatever. That usually is much more tolerated in city areas. However, having said that, cities, because of all of these things, if everybody around you is different than you are, you may accept that, and that may be okay with you, but you may also not have anybody that you can identify with because you have these small social circles, and most of your relationships are business relationships. That can cause feelings of isolation, that you're by yourself, and that is a huge problem. That disconnection, even though you're living right on top of each other, you are not connected to each other the way that you are in small towns or rural areas. So what causes cities to grow, right? So we're talking about urban growth. There are a couple of stages of urban growth. There's the stage of export specialization. Now, this is not a progression, right? Certain cities go through different stages. Certain cities get stuck in different stages, right? It's not like we start here and go to here, right? So there's the stage of export specialization. This is where your local economy is centered on one basic sector, right? And that could be steel, for instance. There's the stage of export complex. That's where your local economy has multiple, maybe you do steels and cars, right? Maybe you also have advertising for those cars, whatever. Then you have the stage of economic maturation, and this is where the local economy is going to replace imports of things with local products and services. Now you have enough of a base that you can provide those non-basic sector services and things to locally, right? And then you also have this stage of regional metropolis. And this is where your city is serving as a node of travel for products, right? Whatever. And the city exports products and services to satellite cities, okay? Now, sometimes this can be followed by the stage of national or international metropolis, and that means that it's not just regional, you're going countrywide, you're going global, whatever, okay? And then there's the stage of technical professional virtuosity, and this is where you have some technical specialized skill your city is known for, okay? Now, why do cities actually grow or not, as the case may be? Because cities have risen and fallen throughout history. What makes that happen? Well, cities move from one stage to another with momentum, right? So let's say that you have an industry, it's very successful, you can bring in other industries, you have this momentum. Local advantages like resources, labor, transportation routes, things like that. And luck. I mean, what you have available to you is luck. Who starts what where is kind of luck, and so that does play into it. Now, there are some factors that can limit urban growth, okay, and that is failure of momentum. You just don't have it. Too much competition. Let's say I want to do steel, you want to do steel, we're cities. One of us is going to do better, right? Let's say that you're doing steel and I'm doing steel, but you have iron ore and I have to ship it in, right? Also, lack of talent. You may not have skill sets to actually do the things that you need. And by skill sets, I mean you don't have people who are capable of doing the kind of work. And also, poor urban management is a real killer to urban growth. You need to have city managers, right, that understand what's best for the city and don't just focus on whatever their individual, crisis or passion or, platform is, that they have to understand the city as a whole and do what's best for the city as a whole, okay? And also sometimes economic restructuring. As things change, maybe it's not always in the best, especially if you're restructuring after losses. Okay, now here's your question. Televisions and other mass media contribute to urban growth because people must move close to town to get TV reception. There's so many jobs in media. TV is used to advertise about labor shortages. TV makes urban life appear luxurious and accessible. And TV educates people about the drawbacks of living in rural areas. Well, I'm going to tell you right now, the last one, that is just not true. I mean, there may be instances in which TV makes living in rural areas not as glamorous, but that would be number 4, that TV makes urban life appear luxurious and accessible, that you could have this if you just moved to the city. It's not really about drawbacks of rural areas because, there are drawbacks living in the city too. We don't advertise labor shortages, right? Not really that many jobs in media comparatively. And with satellites, you can get TV wherever you want, really. So the answer was 4. Now, I just want to mention cities typically do not experience major population losses as a whole because of several factors, right? They may experience urban decay, which we'll talk about later on, which is the degradation, loss, whatever, of the inner cities areas. But they'll have a shift in the spatial location of the jobs that used to be there and the goods that were available, okay? And this is the urban size ratchet theory that we're about to talk about. So anymore, cities really don't just dwindle away. Why? Because you have things like industrial diversification. Large cities, in some ways you can think of this as the too big to fail idea, except in this case they really are. And so you have industrial diversification, large cities that have an economy that's broad enough to recover, okay, and so they can basically weather tough times. Political power. Large cities actually have enough political clout that they can get aid locally, regionally, nationally. Okay. You also have this idea that you are not going to abandon billions of dollars, right? You have all of these fixed assets and you have to just ride it out. And customers will drive firm locations, and in cities you have populations, and so firms are going to stay, right? And so people are a local natural resource, and large areas have more opportunities for entrepreneurship. The sheer size of a population is going to guarantee you more opportunities than anywhere else, okay? Which brings us to the idea that cities can continue to grow and grow and grow into megacities. An example of a megacity is Mexico City, LA, Tokyo, Calcutta, or all of these. Well, it turns out it's all of these. And when you look at the definition of megacities, megacities have a high degree of centrality and primacy, and we'll talk about primacy in a minute, right? And so they have high levels of influence and power. All of them have more than 10 million inhabitants. Cairo, Mexico City, and Jakarta. I already had Mexico City on the list, but Cairo and Jakarta are 2 more, right? 10 million inhabitants. That is the basic definition of a megacity, by the way. The other things come because they're huge, right? And then you have world cities. And this is different than a megacity. World cities don't have to be megacities, right? But they are cities that control a disproportionately high level of the world's economic, political, and cultural activities. A lot of times these are primate cities, okay? And those have changed over time. This is very flexible, okay? In the 1600s, it was London, Lisbon, Amsterdam. Then in the 1700s, you have Rome and Paris. Today, Berlin, Chicago, New York, right? LA, St. Petersburg. Those are all world cities, although even though we don't think about all of them. And St. Petersburg can be questionable. It's got political stuff going on, Moscow. Political stuff going on, but otherwise not so much. Okay, so now we want to talk a little bit about the rank size rule. The nth largest city in a region will have 1 over n, the population, to the largest city. Okay, so let me explain what I mean by that. Suppose the largest city is 100,000 people, then the 5th largest city will have 1/5 of that 100,000 for the 20,000, okay? And so just to give you an idea, here's Germany. These are not current population numbers, but they have increased in the same way. But here's Berlin, right? You've got 3.3 million. Well, now you've got Hamburg. That's about half, right? Munich is about a third. Cologne is about a fourth. Essen is about a fifth. Okay, so basically when we're talking about the rank size rule, we're saying that the rank of a city is the same as its population. In the urban hierarchy, the rank of a city is inversely proportional to its population. More important cities are on the coast, or the capital is always the largest city. Well, we know from our geography test that 4 is simply not true. Okay. In the urban hierarchy, the rank of a city is inversely proportional to its population. Okay, so the higher the rank, the larger the city is what we're saying. And here's just another example. Here's if you look at the United States as a whole. Here you've got New York, right, 8 million. Los Angeles is about half of that. Chicago is about a third of that. Houston's about a fourth of that. Philadelphia is 5th. Phoenix is 6th, right? San Antonio is 7th. And if you look at, if you actually do 1 over n times the population of the first ranked city, you can see that they're pretty close, actually. So that works pretty well, okay? Now, the rank size rule of urban places does not apply in countries with very dominant primate cities, very long coastlines, mainly urban populations, or interstate highway systems. Well, here's where we want to talk about dominant primate cities, right? Primate cities, what is that? That is the answer. Rank size doesn't apply to primate cities. Primate cities are cities that are disproportionately large to all the rest of them. They are centers of politics, finance, media, culture, and higher education. It's where all the universities are going to be, things like that. And here are 2 examples that I want to give you. Buenos Aires, Argentina, is nearly 10 times the size of its 2nd largest city, which is Rosario, right? Rosario. Managua, Nicaragua, has 30% of Nicaragua's total population and controls 40% of the economy, okay? There aren't any cities that are even half the size of that. I mean, a third or anything like that. And here are some more examples of world cities that are primate cities. So those are not world cities, but here's some world cities that are Paris, right? Marseille is the next largest city. It's definitely not half. London, Birmingham, right, is definitely not the same size. Mexico City to Guadalajara, no. Bangkok to Nantaburi, right? No. Okay, so these are primate cities. So the other thing that I want you to take away is that primate cities don't have to occur in developing nations. They are also in developed nations. The United States follows the rank size rule really, really well. Germany does, right? Some other places do, but then some developed countries do not. Okay. Especially when you have places that have smaller populations, but they have mega cities. There's a good indicator that you're probably going to find some primate cities there. Okay, or a primate city. All right, what is a megalopolis? We've talked a little bit about this, but I just want to revisit it because we're talking about cities. They have a high population density, covers hundreds of square miles. There are concentrations of numerous older cities together, so they kind of become one city. There are tons of transportation links, freeways, railroads, airplane travel, rapid transit, whatever. And they often have a very high proportion of the nation's wealth, commerce, and political power. The Bowash corridor was one that we had talked about before. Was this megalopolis, and so I've put it here. under this network city conversation, because sometimes these megalopolises can be mistaken for network cities. A network city is two or more cities that are partially complementary. Well, that was crazy. Complementary in functions, and so you have this networking pattern. And there are two. I want to show you one in Japan and one in the Netherlands. And here you have Kyoto, which is the cultural capital, and then you have Osaka, which is the commercial industrial area, and then you have Kobe, which is the port, right? And together, they actually compete with Tokyo as a center of commerce, but it's the three of them working in concert. And in Europe, you have the same thing here, like I said, in the Netherlands. You have Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague. And so this is the network city there, and they are very competitive. Now, like I said, the United States doesn't really have a network city, although we have that megalopolis of Bowash, and they're the closest example that we can find to a network city. But each of those cities provides something unique, but mostly they're providing similar services. They just work together. Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit about spatial growth, and this is urban sprawl, and this is what your case study is going to be about today. Partly I want to focus on urban sprawl because Dallas is like all over urban sprawl. I mean, we are sprawling, and we can because we have space, but the question becomes, is it a good idea? Okay, but first, urbanization began to grow especially quickly after the development of agriculture, beginning of the 20th century, the Industrial Revolution, the invention of commerce and religion, the invention of record keeping. Well, that would be the Industrial Revolution. So, how do municipalities grow? At the margins of urban areas, right, you can extend out urban structures and infrastructure into this rural fringe. That is sprawl. So cities begin to sprawl out. And they really do it two ways. Agglomeration, where you have municipalities annexing non-urban land that's adjacent to urban land. And they actually can just do that. They can just be like, yep, this is mine. They also will put in urban services, sewers, transportation arteries. They'll extend out into these non-urban areas. And roads are like, if you build it, they will come. If you build a road, people will start following that road and extending the city out. And then there's fragmentation. Landowners will divide non-urban land on the margins into private and public spaces, which means they're selling them to different people for different things. Okay. All right. Now, the process of urban sprawl is interesting because land prices decrease as you move away from the city center, which makes that land really desirable. Okay. So middle-class people often opt for these cheaper homes because they feel like it gives them a higher standard of living outside the city. And oftentimes they actually do have a higher standard of living. Okay. And so development begins to jump the borders of the city because remember, if you build it, they will come. And growth will kind of proceed like there'll be a subdivision here, there'll be a company that relocates here, or whatever. And it'll be sporadically and rapidly. But city planners, if they want to make this successful, are going to have to catch up with that. Oftentimes, cities like Dallas just sprawl out, and there isn't a whole lot of city planning that goes on. Sometimes people will anticipate that. Plano actually did a really good job of anticipating spread and things like that. And Frisco's done a pretty good job of that. But lots of other cities just kind of like, just expand it out, right? Kind of like the blob. Ultimately, though, one thing I want you to keep in mind is that it is the car that makes all of this possible. The automobile, okay? Suburban sprawl makes people dependent on transportation. It's hard to have mass transit systems when you have really spread out institutions, right, and residences, okay? As advances in transportation increase, you can go farther away. And the government actually supported the rise of the car with all of the highway systems after World War II, right, and suburban zoning. And it turns out that suburbs are really an important user of land in cities, we've talked a little bit about, and we'll talk about more. Okay, so that brings us to the peripheral model. The peripheral model, we've talked about edge cities. This is just really the model that describes how edge cities, come about. You have suburban residential and business areas that surround the urban industrial area. They're tied together with a beltway or a ring road. you have specialized nodes, and these become the edge cities. And as the distance from the city increases, the number of houses decreases. You have a change in density gradient. You can spread out a little bit, and that's going to increase in the periphery of the city because there is the ability to spread. Okay, so some of the characteristics of urban sprawl, these edge cities, are excessive land consumption, right? Houses are bigger. There's bigger footprints for buildings. I mean, look at giant parking lots, you know. Low population densities because everything's spread out. Lack of transportation options. Really, it's only the car. There are wide gaps between developments. You get kind of a scattered appearance, especially as you keep going further and further out. There's really a lack of choice in housing types and prices. You'll have these fixed kind of sort of, not prefab, but you'll have these subdivisions that are, well, I totally just forgot the word. Anyway, like Fox and Jacobs and things like that, you have these couple of floor plans that you can buy. And we talked about this when we talked about the decrease in folk housing. There's zoning that separates out areas into distinct usage zones. And you have this repetitive single-family home development, the same houses over and over and over again. Commercial buildings are going to look the same. There's some style. You can tell what decade it was built in, blah, blah, blah. And expansive parking. And most Americans actually live in suburbs nowadays. Okay, and they do most of their stuff in suburbs too. Edge cities will have their own retail, financial, and entertainment districts. So you really don't have to go into the city very much. And anymore, you've got a lot more commuters coming from the inner city to the edge city, whereas it used to be lots of suburban commuters going into the city. And that's really shifting, okay? Highways, trucks, all allow industries to locate outside downtown, which goes back to that kind of automobile issue. And now with telecommuting and things like that, companies can move headquarters away from downtowns. They can move out, they can spread out, and people can spread out too. I mean, you can sit at home and telecommunicate to work, right? Telecommunicate? Well, you're doing that too. But telecommute, sorry. That's crazy talk. All right, now edge cities really do present problems for planners because you have to deal with all this traffic congestion because everybody's got a car. There are environmental concerns as spreading areas consume more and more land, destroy more wild habitat. And then, of course, you have this idea of CO2, right? You're burning tons of fossil fuels with all these cars, but is it possible to provide a mass transit system for an area that has no actual center, right, and is really spread out? That's a really good question. So what do you do about all that? But ultimately, some problems with urban sprawl: inefficient land use, increased energy consumption, increased consumption of goods, increased air pollution, increased tax burden, increased social impacts, which we talked about. And the other thing too is that we talked about this a little bit with folk housing. You can actually drive into your garage from work. You can leave your garage, go to another garage, go to work. You don't ever have to be outside, and you don't ever really have to see anybody that you don't work with or that isn't providing some service to you, and that's crazy. And then there are the strains on the infrastructure. You need all the basic facilities, services, machinery for the community to function, but now you have lots of it. You need lots of it, and everything has to be maintained. Roads, bridges, water lines, sewer lines, electric lines, they all have to be maintained, okay? And then your last question is this. The principal problem with rapid, or it could be rabid too, rapid urban growth, especially in developing countries, is the building of infrastructure cannot keep up with increasing needs, finding skilled labor, physically finding room for people to live, the air and the water pollution problems, or all of these are equally difficult. Well, all of these can be issues, but here's the deal. In developing countries, rapid urban growth, which is happening as people are moving out from rural areas and you're getting more and more megacities, the infrastructure can't keep up with the massive influx of people that you have, okay? Finding room for people to live, that can be problematic, but you can build housing, things like that. It's really the actual infrastructure, the roads, like I said, the roads, the bridges, the water lines, the sewer lines, all of those things. That's going to be the biggest problem. And air and water pollution those are problems too. But the most pressing problem is the lack of infrastructure. Okay, so that is it for this set of notes. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time. And if you have any questions, make sure you ask me in class. All right.